There is a moment most people experience, but rarely examine. You notice that the same grocery run costs more than it did a few years ago. The rent on the apartment you considered has moved beyond what you budgeted. The house you plan to buy one day has appreciated faster than your savings ever could. Nothing dramatic happened to your income. Nothing dramatic happened to your spending habits. But the distance between where you are and where you were trying to get seems wider than it was before. Most people absorb this quietly and move on. A few start asking why. This is the story of one answer, not the only answer, but one that operates so quietly, so structurally, that most people never encounter it by name, even as it shapes the financial landscape around them every decade. It is called the Cantillon Effect, and understanding it does not require economics training. It requires only the willingness to follow a sequence. The order of receipt matters. That is the core of it. When new money enters an economy, it does not arrive everywhere at once. It arrives somewhere first, and the people and institutions closest to that point of entry, the first receivers, get to deploy it before the prices around them have adjusted to reflect its existence. The people further down the chain receive it later, after those adjustments have already begun. Same money, different timing, different outcome. This is not a modern observation. It was articulated in the early 18th century by an Irish-French economist and banker named Richard Cantillon. He was writing at a time when European economies were experimenting with early paper money systems, and he noticed something that the architects of those systems had not fully considered. When new money was introduced, through trade surpluses, through government spending, through the extension of credit, it did not distribute itself evenly across the population like rain falling on a field. It flowed. It moved through specific channels, reaching specific hands first, before spreading outward toward the rest of the economy. Cantillon observed that those first hands, the merchants, the landowners, the institutions closest to the source, could purchase goods and assets at prices that had not yet responded to the new money. By the time that money had traveled through enough hands to reach workers and small traders and ordinary households, prices had often moved. The purchasing power of the new money had, in a meaningful sense, been partially consumed by those who received it earlier. He wrote this down. It sat largely forgotten for centuries. The financial architecture changed. The mechanism did not. To understand why this still matters, it helps to understand what actually happens when modern economies expand their money supply. This is frequently discussed in simplified terms: printing money, turning on the press. But the actual mechanics are more layered and worth slowing down to examine, because the layers matter enormously for who receives what and when. There are two primary channels through which new money enters a modern economy. The first involves the central bank, the institution responsible for managing a country's monetary system. When a central bank wants to expand liquidity, one of its primary tools is the purchase of financial assets, typically government bonds, from financial institutions. In simple terms, the central bank creates reserves, new entries on a balance sheet, and uses them to buy assets that those institutions are holding. The financial institution now holds reserves instead of bonds. The central bank holds bonds instead of reserves. New liquidity has entered the financial system. Notice who is in the room when this happens. Not households, not small businesses, not wage earners, financial institutions. The first receivers of this new liquidity are operating within financial markets. The second channel is credit creation through lending. When a bank extends a loan, it does not pull that money from a vault. It creates a new deposit, a new entry, and the borrower now holds purchasing power that did not exist in that form before. This is how the majority of money in modern economies is actually created, not by governments running physical presses, but by the daily act of lending. And the recipients of this new money depend entirely on who is in a position to borrow, who has the collateral, the creditworthiness, the assets that allow access to credit on favorable terms. These are different channels with different first receivers, but they share a structural commonality. New liquidity tends to enter through financial and institutional pathways before it reaches broader economic participants. This is not deliberate exclusion, it is architecture, and architecture has consequences. Imagine, purely as a thought exercise, that a significant quantity of new liquidity enters the financial system through the first channel described. Financial institutions now hold more reserves. What happens next? Those institutions deploy that liquidity. They lend, they invest, they purchase assets. And because a meaningful volume of new purchasing power is now moving through financial markets before it has moved anywhere else, the prices of financial assets, equities, bonds, real estate, can begin to respond before the prices of everyday goods and services do. The person who holds financial assets watches their value move upward. The person whose wealth exists primarily in a savings account, in a wage, in a fixed income, watches the same period pass without the same adjustment. The gap between those two experiences, in that window of time, is the Cantillon effect in operation. Wealth diverges not through any single transaction, but through timing. This connects directly to something that confuses many people when they try to understand inflation. The commonly referenced measure of consumer price inflation, the index that tracks the cost of a basket of goods and services, does not move in the same way or at the same time as asset prices. And this distinction is not a technical footnote. It is central to understanding how the Cantillon effect distributes its effects unevenly. When new liquidity enters through financial channels, the assets held within those channels can appreciate relatively quickly. Property values in certain markets, equity prices, the kinds of holdings that appear on the balance sheets of institutions and on the portfolios of those with investable capital. This appreciation is real. It changes the net worth of those who hold these assets in ways that the standard consumer price index does not capture, because the index is not measuring asset prices. It is measuring the cost of goods and services. So it becomes possible, and this has been observed repeatedly across different economic periods, for a phase of significant monetary expansion to produce a measured consumer inflation rate that appears moderate while simultaneously producing substantial appreciation in asset values. The household tracking grocery prices and rent does not see the same signal as the institution tracking the value of its portfolio. Two different experiences of the same monetary event, one captured by the headline number, one not. Here it becomes important to be precise about what the Cantillon effect does and does not explain. It is one mechanism among several that influence the distribution of wealth across an economy. It operates within a much larger system shaped by tax policy, labor markets, inheritance, education, geography, and many other forces. Acknowledging the Cantillon effect does not mean attributing every instance of wealth concentration to this single cause. It also does not imply permanence. Economic theory holds that over a sufficiently long period, new money fully distributes through the economy and prices adjust across the board. The temporary advantage that early receivers hold diminishes as the money moves outward and price levels recalibrate. The effect is most pronounced in the window between when new liquidity enters and when prices fully adjust, a window that can, depending on the scale and nature of the expansion, last months or years. And it is essential to say this clearly. The Cantillon effect is not evidence of coordinated favoritism. Policymakers who expand monetary supply during periods of economic stress are typically responding to specific and serious problems: a contracting credit market, a collapsing financial system, a recession that threatens widespread unemployment. The interventions are often defensible in terms of preventing outcomes that would be worse for everyone, including those at the bottom of the income distribution. The distributional side effects that occur are, in most cases, a consequence of how the financial architecture is structured, not the deliberate intention of the people operating within it. Structure produces outcomes regardless of intention. This is the sentence worth sitting with. A system does not need to be designed with a particular outcome in mind to consistently produce that outcome. If the pathways through which new liquidity flows tend to reach asset holders before they reach wage earners, that sequence will produce its distributional effect regardless of whether anyone in the process intended it. The mechanism operates at the level of architecture, not motive. Understanding this changes the nature of the question. It is not useful to ask who is to blame for the Cantillon effect. It is more useful to ask how financial architecture shapes outcomes and what it would mean to understand that architecture clearly enough to navigate within it more deliberately. The sequence runs in one direction. Now consider what this means practically. Not as investment advice, which this is not, but as a shift in how one understands the financial landscape. Most people are taught to think about money primarily in terms of income. Earn more, spend less, save the difference. This is not wrong as a starting principle, but the Cantillon framework suggests that income alone, particularly wage income, arrives relatively late in the sequence. By the time a wage increase reflects the conditions created by a period of monetary expansion, significant adjustments may already have occurred upstream. Saving in cash preserves nominal value, but can lose ground to asset appreciation in ways that the account balance does not visibly reflect. This is not an instruction to do anything specific. It is an invitation to see the difference between holding a claim on money and holding a claim on something whose value moves with the broader system. The distinction between income and wealth is related. Income is a flow, it arrives, and if it is consumed, it leaves. Wealth is a stock, it accumulates, it compounds, it participates in the system's adjustments over time. The Cantillon effect operates most meaningfully on stocks, not flows. Those who hold assets participate in the early-stage price movements that monetary expansion can produce. Those who hold only income flows participate later, if at all, and often only after prices have already moved. Understanding timing, not to predict markets, but to understand why the system produces the outcomes it does, is itself a form of financial literacy that most formal education does not deliver. Seeing the sequence is not the same as controlling it, but it is a starting point. There is also something worth sitting with at a slower pace, the philosophical dimension of what the Cantillon effect reveals about modern economies. We live in systems built on abstractions. Money is an abstraction. Credit is an abstraction. The numbers that appear in financial accounts are representations of claims, not physical things. And within that system of abstractions, timing and proximity to the source of new money creation carry real, material consequences. The farmer who receives higher prices for crops after the money has circulated through the economy is in a different position than the banker who received the liquidity before prices moved. They both participated in the same economy during the same period. They both used the same currency, but their experiences of that period were structurally different because of where they sat in the sequence. Cantillon noticed this in the 18th century. The mechanisms have evolved considerably. The core observation has not. Wealth is not only a function of what you earn or save, it is also a function of when you receive and what form that receipt takes. Some forms appreciate, some do not. Some positions in the sequence benefit from expansion. Some absorb the costs of it. The sequence is not random, and knowing it exists is different from never having heard of it. There is a reason this concept does not appear in standard financial literacy curricula. It is not because it is especially complex. It is because it describes a feature of the financial system that most people interact with as participants without ever having been given a map. The map does not guarantee any particular outcome, but navigating without it means experiencing the system's effects without understanding their origin. Every time you have watched asset prices rise faster than your income, you are observing one part of this. Every time you have felt the cost of living shift upward while your savings held still, you are absorbing one part of this. Every time you have wondered why the distance between financial stability and financial precarity seems to grow in certain periods more than others, this mechanism was at work, alongside others, but genuinely at work. It does not explain everything. No single mechanism does. But it explains something real, and something that operates continuously, quietly, beneath the surface of the financial news cycle. Now you can see the sequence, not as a reason for anger, which would not change the architecture, not as a reason for despair, which would only remove you from the conversation, but as a framework, one lens among several, for understanding why the financial landscape looks the way it does, and why certain positions within it tend to persist across economic cycles. The Cantillon effect does not make the system immovable, it makes it legible. And legibility is where every informed decision begins. If understanding how systems actually work, not the simplified version, but the structural mechanics beneath the surface, is something you want to continue, this channel exists for exactly that purpose. No urgency, no pressure. But if this conversation opened something worth continuing, the next exploration is already here. The sequence continues, so can you.